All right, so we have the contractile proteins, and there are two versions of this. The contractile proteins are your thin filament and your thick. Right? Thin filament, actin. Thick filament, myosin. So you have so far 5 different proteins. Now, the regulatory proteins regulate when these two interact. Myosin and actin causes the muscles to shorten. Those are the functional ones. But you need to regulate when they interact with each other. If you don't, most of you guys have had a cramp before. Sucks, doesn't it? What happens then is when you have a cramp, you have the muscle contracting all at once and you can't control it, right? And you're screaming in pain trying to stretch it out. That would suck if that happens all the time. So we need a way to regulate when these two proteins, actin and myosin, interact with each other. We want it to interact only when we want intended movement. So we need regulatory proteins that regulates their actions. The regulatory proteins right here are also found on the thin filament. And there's 2 of them. There's troponin and tropomyosin. Now, when we look at troponin and tropomyosin, take a look. They're both found on the thin filament, and we'll talk about dystrophin in a second, right? I'm going to talk about actin and myosin first, and then troponin and tropomyosin. So what we're going to see is that the actin composed of G-actin monomers, each of which has an active binding site for myosin head. The actin active binding site binds the myosin head, allowing a muscle contraction to occur. In other words, right, the purpose of actin is it contains binding sites. For myosin heads. Contains binding sites for the myosin heads. Perfect. Right? That's all it is. So on one side, the thin filament is anchored to the Z disc. So we'll write that down as well. On one side is anchored to the Z disc. So that makes it important. At the same time, it also has a binding site, so then myosin can interact with it. The myosin is the important part right here for actual movement. Myosin has heads that will contact actin binding site and move actin medially. So it's a myosin that causes a movement. Again, do you see this kind of on this picture in slide 16? You see the purple, it looks like little grapes right here, right? These purple circular monomers of actin. On one side, it's anchored to the Z disc. And then you have these yellow dots inside them. Those are the binding sites. What we're going to see is when the binding sites are open, myosin is going to reach and pull. As it reaches and pulls, myosin on this side is going to reach up on actin and pull actin towards the middle. What happens? The Z disc moves towards the middle. On this side, other side, the myosin is going to reach up and pull actin to the middle again. The Z disc then moves towards the middle. What happens when everything moves towards the middle? It shortens. All right, that is a contraction. Now, that's caused by the myosin heads here. All right, the myosin head gives us the energy so then we can move actin. And by moving actin, we move the Z disc. And we're going to see, when we move the Z disc, we take that tension and put it to the plasma membrane. This is why dystrophin is so important coming up. Right? Again, we'll come back to it in just a second about how the muscle contracts. The next thing I want to talk about is how do we make sure that that muscle contracts only when we want it to contract? That's where these two proteins come in. Some of you guys might have heard of troponin before. Troponin is one of the lab values we have when somebody has a myocardial infarct. Right? We don't like using the word heart attack. Right? If I say somebody does or is having a heart attack, it can be you're having a blood clot that's causing it, or it can be a cardiac rhythm issue, an arrhythmia causing it. We don't know what's causing it, right? You will have two different treatments for that heart attack. If you're having a blood clot, the last thing I want to do is shock you, right? If you're having a arrhythmia, the last thing I want to do is just kind of give you a blood thinner, right? You need to be shocked. By saying a heart attack, you can't tell which is which. When most people have a cardiac event, they're usually having a blood clot. A heart attack, usually what we're mentioning, usually refers to that. There's a blood clot in the coronary arteries, and now they have the chest pain, all right? They're diaphoretic, really sweaty, right? They have left arm pain, all of that. That is usually what we call a myocardial infarct. When we're having a myocardial infarct, this value increases. Why? It's because skeletal muscles, cardiac muscles, both striated. Because they're both striated, skeletal and cardiac muscle have both of these, thick and thin filaments, right? They also have troponin and tropomyosin that are similar. So what is troponin? Right? Troponin is a calcium binding protein. That moves tropomyosin. Remember when I said calcium is really important? Tropomyosin is the gate. A gate that blocks the binding sites found on actin. In other words, tropomyosin is a gate. It's the one that makes sure that when your muscles are not expected to contract, when you are in a relaxed situation, what happens then? Well, in a relaxed situation, the tropomyosin here blocks any actin-myosin from interacting, right? If we allow muscles to interact, they will contract. The myosin head is always ready to go. As long as you're alive, the myosin head is already caught and ready to go. If we didn't have tropomyosin, you'll keep contracting that muscle over and over again, right? Because you have so many ATPs in your muscles. So in order for us to relax, we need to cut off actin from myosin. That's where tropomyosin comes in. Tropomyosin blocks the binding site. As it blocks the binding site, myosin can't reach up and make contact with actin. Because it can't make contact with actin, it falls back down. There's no reaction. Everything spreads out. Right? When we want a muscle contraction to occur, calcium binds on troponin. Troponin then starts to move tropomyosin out of the way. As tropomyosin is shifted out of the way, now the binding site's open. As the binding site's open, myosin and actin interact, allowing us then to pull on actin actin then pulls on the Z disc, and then actin pulls on the plasma membrane, allowing the whole cell to shorten in that area. Now what else are we going to see? A couple of the regulatory proteins, right? So this kind of talks about what we just mentioned, about that binding sites with it blocked by tropomyosin, then moved out of the way when calcium is released. Calcium, with its release, binds to troponin, and then troponin moves tropomyosin out. That's why I say calcium links these two regions, these two parts. Right? Myosin heads, right here. Myosin heads bind to the active binding sites on actin, forming cross bridges. Cross bridges are just a fancy name of actin-myosin interaction. The more cross bridges, the more actin and myosin interact with each other, the stronger the contraction. The myosin heads are very similar to what we see in a golf club, right? The big difference is they can hinge, move back and forth. Right? When there's ATP available, it cocks its head and it's ready to go. So then as soon as we are able to move tropomyosin out of the way, myosin head's ready to go. It's going to reach and pull immediately. Right? So the head region contains ATPase enzyme that breaks down ATP, releasing energy, cocking the head. So then we can cause movement of actin and then movement of the Z disc. Right? Now, in terms of structural, titin is a big one. Right? Titin, elastic chains of amino acid and the important thing with that is that it makes the muscles extensible and elastic. AA is amino acid. And extensible, meaning that it's able to stretch and then go back to normal position. And then when you contract it, it's able to, once relaxed, pull the Z disc apart from each other. So let's take a look at what I mean by this. So here's a Z disc. Here is the Z disc right here. Here's titin. Titin looks like springs, doesn't it? It looks like springs on each side. And what's going to happen is when you contract the muscle, the space between the Z disc shortens. As it shortens, when you relax, you need to spread it out again, right? That's what we mean by that recoil right here. So as we relax that muscle, you need to spread that space between the Z disc. When you contract, the space narrows. When you relax, you need to stretch it out again. That's where the coils of titin comes in. So when you relax, the titin pulls those Z disc space further apart. Perfect. So then when we contract next, you're at a real optimal length, right? So then you have a muscle that's going to contract with a lot of power. The next one, I don't think you have this on your notes, so just write it in. Next one is dystrophin. This is incredibly important, right? Links actin to the outermost myofilaments, in the outermost myofilaments to transmembrane proteins, eventually linking the actin to the endomysium of the entire muscle cell. In other words, it links what happens inside the cell to what happens on the outside. So as a muscle cell shortens internally, the whole cell shortens. The plasma membrane shortens, right? If you don't have dystrophin, you will still have a shortening of the muscle fibers inside. So with all those myofibrils, all the actin and myosin still interact with each other. But the cell itself doesn't shorten, right? Because the cell itself doesn't shorten, you don't create tension on the tendon, and you don't have the bone actually move. So this dystrophin allows us to transfer forces of muscle contraction to the connective tissue of the muscle and eventually to the tendons. Now, keep in mind that when we look at this, most of you guys have heard of muscular dystrophy. In muscular dystrophy, what happens is they're missing dystrophin, right? The worst form of muscular dystrophy, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, you will see that in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, there's almost all of the dystrophin is going to be severely affected. And since all of it is severely affected, right, usually by the time a child hits 5, 6 years of age, they can't support their body weight. So they're in a wheelchair, right? And then the muscles start to even get worse. They have a harder time controlling the muscles. The muscles stop pulling on the tendons, and they can't move their arms and legs anymore. Eventually, when they hit teenage years, you can't move your diaphragm, right? The diaphragm is a skeletal muscle. And when that occurs in the diaphragm, usually we're left with two choices. Do we intubate that teenager, knowing that for the rest of their lives, they'll be permanently paralyzed? Or do we let them go, right? This is a genetic lethal disease. The only way we can save their life is we put the tube into their throat and breathe for them, right? And then you have that question, do we put that tube in? Because once you put that tube in your throat, right, and you start ventilating, there are some real law issues that we have to deal with, not just medical ethics. And there has been a huge battle between this, right? At what point do you get to choose whether you can die, right? With assisted suicide, things like that. So once you intubate, all of that is gonna you have to be worried for the rest of their lives about that. And again, there is no treatment, right? I have a friend that's little nephew had this. And again, it's a genetic lethal. This is what we call an X-linked recessive disease, muscular dystrophy, right? In muscular dystrophy, boys get the disease. Women are usually the carriers. The reason why, right? Simple. It's what we call an X-linked recessive disease, right? So I'm going to show you the Punnett squares and why boys get it and women don't. Usually in the X-linked recessive disease, sometimes called the sex-linked recessive disease, what happens, right? Well, it's carried by the X chromosome, right? So women are XX. They have two versions. Usually women have one healthy version and one disease version. The good news about this is that because you have two of the X chromosomes, the disease X chromosome is shut down. Only the good one is used. But boys don't have that. Boys only have one X chromosome. If you inherit the bad X chromosome, you have to express it, and you'll have the full-blown disease. So what happens with this? We assume dad's healthy. Because if dad isn't healthy, he's not going to be functional enough to have kids, right? And what happens? We put those squares and the letters down. This XX female, completely healthy, not a carrier. She doesn't have to worry about any disease for her kids, right? 25% chance of healthy female. 25% chance of females with carrier trait. Right? Now, they're not going to express any trait. What you will have to worry about are her kids. This boy got very lucky. All right, this boy got mom's good X chromosome, and then the Y from dad. 25% chance of boy without disease, completely healthy. This is an unlucky boy. This boy, right here, right, will have the disease. In other words, right, not only is it shortened lifespan, usually the kids here are perfectly normal, even high intelligence, meaning they know what's coming. Right? What you do if you know that you will be dead by the time you are 18, 17, and before that, you'll be in a wheelchair until then, without being able to move. Right? You can imagine the kind of scars you get psychologically. In my friend's family, it completely broke apart the family. Right? They had a little sister that wasn't a carrier. Only the brother was affected. What happened? Nobody talked to each other. The mother and the husband got divorced. The daughter went to live with somebody else, right, as a result of this. So this can happen. This kind of, it's not just, Duchenne's that's like this. There's also other X-linked recessive diseases. An example, right, is hemophilia. That's also an X-linked recessive disease. So it does happen. When you hear about mom giving their, disease to the sons, right? This is what usually they're talking about. This kind of inherited traits. Usually women are not affected because you need to be incredibly unlucky to have two bad X chromosomes for women. And usually when you have two bad ones, it is a very severe form of it, right? Usually those women or those girls, they don't survive infancy, right? Usually they get spontaneously miscarried. All right, let's take a break.